What's the real reason the US military is reviving airfields from World War II? It's not nostalgia, and it's not about history. These forgotten airfields, like Tinian, are about to play a crucial role in countering China's ambitions in the Pacific. While Beijing busies itself building fake islands, piles of sand and concrete in the South China Sea, the US is taking decisive action. By bringing these strategic airfields back to life, America is reminding China who's really in charge of the Pacific and giving it plenty to worry about. So what's the US plan, and why does Tinian matter so much? Let's dive in and uncover the full story, starting with the question on everyone's lips: what is Tinian exactly? To answer that, we need a quick history lesson. Lying just south of Japan and west of the Philippines, Tinian is an island that is currently part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which are administered by the US. The island is tiny, measuring just 39 square miles. For context, that's just under 1% of the size of Yellowstone National Park. But though it may be tiny, Tinian has a long history of being fought over by global powers because it provides a key strategic position within the Pacific. The Missouri University of Science and Technology, or MST, provides more details. Following the end of World War I, Japan took control of Tinian, giving it a vital strategic position to the east of the Philippine Sea. Several years later, Japan found itself embroiled in World War II, fighting against China and later the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor pushed the US into that war and made Japan a clear target for retaliation. America identified Tinian as the perfect place from which to launch attacks on the Japanese mainland. The problem? Japan still controlled the island, meaning the US would have to take it by force. It did just that during the summer of 1944. The US identified a pair of beaches on Tinian, dubbed White 1 and White 2, that it could use to conduct a landing. It sent troops across the Pacific toward Japan, with soldiers loading into Amtrak vessels en route to those beaches. Both were tiny, measuring less than 200 feet wide apiece, meaning America's traditional landing tactics wouldn't work. So it came up with a clever idea: build what essentially amounted to wooden rafts dubbed doodlebugs that it mounted to its Amtraks and would allow it to land soldiers and US Marines onto Tinian. Those ramps allowed soldiers to easily scale the 8-foot cliffs that dotted the White Beach landing zones. But that wasn't enough. The US knew it would face heavy resistance if it attacked the White Beaches alone, so it launched a diversionary strike targeted at the coast of Tinian Town on the island's southwest. American soldiers fought with the Japanese troops stationed on the island, distracting them long enough for the US Marines to land on the White Beaches to the northwest. Once landed, those Marines headed south, catching the Japanese soldiers in a pincer movement that allowed America to take the island. The United States had won a crucial battle. How crucial would become apparent as World War II drew to its conclusion. With Tinian under its control, along with the previously Japanese-controlled island of Saipan to Tinian's northeast, the United States got to work. Construction began on what would have been the world's largest air bases, according to MST. 4 runways were built, each 8,500 feet long, to the island's north, with a further 2 being built at Westfield in Tinian's southwest region. Those large runways had a specific purpose. Photographs from this World War II-era construction project showed hard stands put in place for America's B-29 bombers. Japan would have watched these developments with great interest. It had conducted a successful sneak attack on the United States using its aerial assets. Now the US looked like it was preparing to respond in kind. Tinian was being transformed into a base from which the US could send bombers over the 1,500 to 1,700 miles between Tinian and Japan's mainland. Those planes would drop explosives the likes of which have never been used to target the country. Japan knew that bombs were incoming, but it didn't know exactly what types of bombs the United States had in mind. Tinian evolved into a 40,000-person US base in the space of a few months. The 20th Air Force stationed itself on the base, using it to launch firebombing raids on Japanese cities. That same group also dropped mines in Japanese harbors, preventing food from reaching them in what the Americans dubbed Operation Starvation. These were all attacks that Japan may have been able to absorb for several years, were it not for another American operation that was underway as it took over Tinian Island: the Manhattan Project. That project resulted in the US creating the world's first atomic bombs. It wouldn't be long before Japan would feel the full force of these nuclear explosives, with Tinian playing a crucial role. On July 16, 1945, the USS Indianapolis set out from San Francisco to Tinian. It arrived about 10 days later, delivering the components for the Little Boy and Fat Man bombs. It's unknown if Japan understood exactly what the 610-foot ship was delivering to the US forces on Tinian, but it saw a clear target. On July 30th, the Japanese submarine I-58 torpedoed the USS Indianapolis, sinking the ship and killing 879 of its crew. As devastating as such a tremendous loss of life always is, Japan's attack had come too late. Atomic bombs were now on Tinian. It took the US around half a month to build the bombs it was preparing to drop on Japan using the components the USS Indianapolis delivered. On August 5, 1945, it was ready to launch the most devastating attacks in history. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets of the 509th Composite Group moved his B-29 bomber plane, which he named Enola Gay after his mother, over a bomb loading pit. He then taxied to the North Field, where he waited until the early hours of August 6th. Taking off at 2:45 a.m., Tibbets took around 5.5 hours to reach Hiroshima, where he dropped the little boy atomic bomb. The city was decimated by the blast. 3 days later, a different B-29, along with support planes, took off from Tinian, carrying the Fat Man bomb to Nagasaki. The result was the same. The bomb was dropped successfully and the planes returned to their island base. The true purpose of the United States taking over Tinian was revealed. Its two powerful atomic bombs had killed an estimated 214,000 people, according to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Realizing the true scale of the threat his country now faced, Japan's emperor surrendered less than a week after Fat Boy landed on Nagasaki. We tell you all of this to highlight just how important Tinian Island was in terms of providing the United States with a position from which to attack in the Pacific. Without the island, it may have found no way to deploy its atomic weapons in Japan. World War II may have lasted even longer as a result. Instead, Tinian arguably became the most important scrap of territory the US claimed during that war, thanks to it providing America with a base from which to launch the most devastating attacks in history. But all of that was in 1945. In the many decades that followed, Tinian's military airfields fell into disrepair as the US and Japan became allies. There was no need to maintain the island. Through much of the 20th century, China was far from the sort of geopolitical power it later became. The US had no real threats in the Pacific, meaning it didn't need to maintain Tinian. The island had served its purpose. At least that was until Chinese President Xi Jinping embarked on his decades-long crusade to modernize his country and transform it into a military superpower. Today, China has the largest military out of all the Pacific countries, with over 2 million active personnel and another 510,000 in reserve. It has an air force with 3,304 aerial assets, according to Global Firepower, and the second largest navy in the world in terms of pure asset numbers. And it's using that massive firepower to threaten, cajole, and intimidate its way into becoming the big Pacific power broker. We see that with the Spratly Islands, with none of the other countries that have a claim to those rocks being capable of fending off China alone. President Xi has also ramped up his rhetoric about China taking control of Taiwan, with the US Department of Defense estimating that the People's Liberation Army will be ready for the task by 2027. The US can't allow China to invade Taiwan. In fact, it can't allow what the Department of Defense calls the ambitious dragon to do anything that would lead to it gaining even more power in the Pacific. So the US is doing something it never thought it would have to do: revitalize the airfields at Tinian, bringing back to life an island that proved so vital to its victory over Japan in World War II. Now the questions are simple. What is the United States doing at Tinian, and why is China rightfully terrified? We'll start with the what question. In the early 2020s, Business Insider reported that the United States was in the process of scouring the Pacific in search of more airfields it could use to counter the increasing problems China presented in the ocean. The goal was simple: disperse US forces beyond the large but locationally similar bases it already had to give America wider reach and coverage in the Pacific. That news came in the wake of China developing more long-range missiles, according to Business Insider. Those missiles could easily reach several American bases, particularly those in northern Japan, leading to America being hit hard from the off if a war broke out. America needed to find bases that were further afield while still offering coverage within the Pacific. Tinian fit the bill. Speaking at an Air and Space Forces Association conference, General Kenneth Wilsbach noted that Tinian isn't completely unused. It still had one operational runway, which served as an international airfield in the wake of World War II. But the much larger runways the US had used to send its planes to Japan so many decades before were largely overgrown by the jungle, but the runways and taxiways are still underneath, according to the general. That hasn't stopped the US from using the island on occasion. In 2012, it set up mobile arresting gear that would allow it to land its FA-18D jets during an exercise that included Tinian. A few years later, the US Air Force chose the island to host what it calls a divert airfield, which is used to support training exercises and ensure aircraft meet the necessary standards for their missions. That decision led to the US breaking ground on refurbishing a runway just north of Tinian's main runway. Work was underway, and more would come. By the time 2024 rolled around, The US Air Force had adapted its view of Tinian. No longer was it an island that could serve America well for training purposes. It was a strategic location, one America could use to keep an eye on China's actions in the Pacific. The US Air Force tendered a contract covering the rebuilding and refurbishment of several of the island's World War II-era runways. A Texan engineering company named Fluor won that contract, which amounts to $409 million to finish the runway project by 2029. America was already ahead of the contractor, though. In the months prior to awarding the contract, the Air Force had visited the island several times to conduct surveys. Airmen had also started clearing hundreds of acres of jungle, according to Defense News, preparing the island for construction work to begin. The Wall Street Journal, or WSJ, went into more detail about what these construction efforts entail on its YouTube channel. Speaking to Operations Superintendent Master Sergeant Jody Branson, WSJ discovered that the US Air Force first had to locate the old airfields before it started, clearing them for Fluor's work. What my team had to do was go through the jungle, find these coordinates on GPS, and mark them for the boundary of the airfield, Branson told the news outlet. His team was armed with sticks and machetes they used to tear down pieces of jungle to establish pathways to these World War II-era airfields. Fighting through rain, humidity, and the blazing heat of the days on the island, the team spent several months cutting its way through the dense forest on Tinian. By the time they were done, the WSJ says, the US Air Force had cleared areas the size of multiple football fields until Tinian's runways were uncovered. Squadron Commander Major Blake Rothschild led a team responsible for getting rid of this undergrowth. He took WSJ on a tour of the airfields, highlighting runway Charlie and noting how it was previously completely covered in plant life. Now it's fully opened up and can be traversed using vehicles. Our team is really just the first step in this process to successfully and adaptively rehabilitate these runways in Tinian North Field, Rothschild told the WSJ. The next step will see the arrival of Fluor to the island, along with another contractor named Black Micro Corp. In May 2024, Tinian's mayor Edwin P. Alden published information about the first phase of the Tinian Divert Airfield. He pointed out that work had begun in 2022, noting that the US likely intends to use Tinian if Andersen Air Force Base in Guam becomes inaccessible due to a war or some other unforeseen calamity. He said the US Air Force anticipates that Black Micro Corp will complete the first phase of its Big Tinian project by October 2025, with construction focusing on building a parking apron suitable for the US military planes. A second phase will follow. Commonwealth Bureau of Military Affairs Special Assistant Danny Aquino says that the second phase will see Black Micro Corp start to build several of the facilities needed to keep the revitalized runway operational. Those include roads, a cargo pad that has a taxiway extension, and a maintenance support facility. Fuel tanks will also be brought to the island, with Black Micro building receipt pipeline and hydrant systems to enable the transfer of that fuel to aircraft. That phase should be completed by October 2026, and a few years after that, the United States will have a fully functional airfield on Tinian once again. The prospect of that airfield terrifies China. It's being forced to stand back and watch as the US converts a once slumbering island into a military base, and there's no doubt that echoes of Tinian's dreadful nuclear past will be reverberating through President Xi's head as America approaches completion of its Tinian project. All of which brings us to the final question in the video. Why does Tinian matter so much in the context of America's strategic maneuvering against China? It all starts with China's actions in the Pacific. We've talked about Beijing building artificial islands near the Spratly Islands already. That allows China to enhance its territorial claims, however illegitimately, in the South China Sea. That's just one part of China's seemingly grand strategy to become the power broker in the Pacific. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is another. Xi's grand ambition for creating what some dub a new Silk Road sees Beijing offering dozens of countries in Asia and Africa loans for building infrastructure. It's been successful too. The Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, says that 147 countries, accounting for about 2/3 of the world's population, have signed up for BRI loans. While that all sounds very amicable, it showcases China's efforts to build stronger relationships with many of the smaller countries that it would later hope to count on as strategic allies if war erupted in the Pacific. Xi touts the BRI as a sign of a more assertive China, according to CFR. Assertive is the correct word, as the terms of BRI loans allow China to demand full payment at any time, potentially leaving the countries that have accepted these loans beholden to Beijing. Other efforts to enhance its influence have seen China sign a defensive pact with the Solomon Islands. There's little purpose to this pact in terms of the Solomon Islands coming to China's aid in a war. The islands have no military, meaning China's cooperation is likely an attempt to curry favor so it can build a military base in the Solomons. The island gets some protection from China, and Beijing gets to build a strategic base in the southwestern Pacific that puts it uncomfortably close to Australia and New Zealand. So America rebuilding the World War II-era airfields on Tinian is a direct response to China's constant power plays in the Pacific. The US wants to reinforce its own presence in the region to prevent China from taking over. Then, there's Tinian's strategic value to consider. Global Security Review says that reinvigorating Tinian provides a strategic foothold for the United States in the Western Pacific. That foothold would enable the US to respond quickly to regional security challenges while ensuring stability. In other words, the Tinian airfields are perfectly placed to allow the US to keep an eye on China and could be the launching point of attacks on Chinese targets, such as the potential military base on the Solomons. Tinian can also serve as a key support point for operations and logistics in the Pacific, according to Global Security Review. The island could become a hub carrying fuel for refueling assets like airplanes and ships as they make their way toward China. Troops could also be moved through Tinian en route to potential Chinese targets, such as Japan and Australia. Speaking of those countries, America's decision to revive airfields it hasn't used since World War II also allows it to strengthen its relationships with key military allies like Japan and South Korea. The US is showing its commitment to maintaining a presence in the Pacific, Global Security Review claims. That commitment will reinforce its relationship with its allies, many of whom are extremely wary of China, and give Beijing something else to think about as it tries to take over the Pacific region. Speaking of something else to think about, revitalizing Tinian also opens what the Joint Air Power Competence Center calls the next big thing for NATO air power, the Agile Combat Employment, or ACE, approach. The WSJ claims that the United States is turning to this approach both to deter China and to prepare for potential hostilities in the future. The idea is to create a network of airfields. That may seem like an old concept, given that the US has prominent bases in the Pacific, particularly in Japan. However, it's those bases for which the ACE approach accounts. If one of America's larger bases comes under a direct threat, such as a missile barrage from China, its aircraft could take off and fan out to a network of smaller sites. Tinian is one such site. The island gives the US an out if China bombs its larger air bases. America could counterattack via Tinian, allowing it to keep the pressure on China as reinforcements arrive. Tinian is far from the only location being considered for this ACE network. The WSJ says the US Air Force has identified several other places that could receive US forces, including a longer string of islands known as the Second Island Chain, which stretches from Japan through to Guam and Micronesia. Establishing these bases would give the US more attacking options in a war against China. It would also force Beijing to stretch itself thinner than it would like, as it needs to hit more targets to prevent a US counterattack. We've mentioned Guam several times in this video, both in reference to the Second Island Chain and Andersen Air Force Base. The WSJ points out that this tiny US-controlled island, which is just 210 square miles, would also be part of any American military strategy involving Tinian. America plans to develop a layered anti-aerial defense plan for Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, which will include Patriot, THAAD, and Aegis systems. If that doesn't work, many of the aircraft stationed in Guam will move to Tinian. It's all about improving the capability of the Andersen base. Pilots stationed at the base will have options if China targets it with its DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile. That missile is known as the Guam Killer, according to WSJ. Tinian would give Guam a second life so China can't rely on its missiles anymore. Granted, there are still challenges for the United States to overcome. Work is far from completed on Tinian, with significant infrastructural upgrades required to restore it to its World War II-era glory. Coordination with several regional stakeholders is also required, according to Global Security Review. The involvement of multiple parties always has the potential to cause delays at a time when the US would want to prepare its ACE strategy as quickly as possible. Still, China is afraid, and it should be. With Tinian, the US is showing that it's prepared to build an even more advanced network of bases in the Pacific than it already has. America is getting more options that make it capable of launching counterattacks and keeping its aerial assets alive in the face of Chinese missile strikes. Tinian won't be the launching point of atomic weapons in the same way that it was during World War II, but it will become a vital airfield once more, one that the US can use to observe and counter China in the Pacific. But what do you think about America's efforts to revive Tinian? Will the base become as vital to the ACE strategy as the US anticipates? Or would China have a counter for Tinian that would allow it to negate the base if war breaks out? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why the new US Manta Ray submarine terrifies China, or click this other video instead.